to open this debate. Here.
Czy ja mam robić
Can you speak up, please?
Can you hear me?
Wait, Antoni, please mute yourself.
Okay, Prime Minister, can you say something so that we can check your mic?
1, 2, 3.
Yeah. You're audible.
Good.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Mr. Speaker, as it stands, we believe any military institution in the status quo lacks checks and balances system, and the checks and balances system would have benefited military in a number of great ways. So that would be the main point that we are going to bring to you from the opening government. But before that, let's just clarify the mechanism and the way this motion is going to be implemented. We believe that soldiers can appeal to civilian courts, which they currently do not have access to, because usually they do have to appeal to tribunal, and as far as I know, they cannot even appeal to the tribunal. Tribunal can punish them, but those soldiers themselves cannot appeal to that instances. The only option for the soldiers in the status quo is just to appeal to higher ranking command, which is also, as I will explain later, is not accessible. So they would appeal to the civilian courts, where for example, on behalf of the Ministry of Defense, they would be suing against each other, and all the due process and other stuff would be actually still there. So we don't think that would differ in a great extent. If there are any clarifications, I want to talk about firstly about the nature of that army. We believe armies in the status quo actually are very close institutions, because simply practically you do have to keep secret information from the intelligence agencies of the other countries. So usually even civilians do not have access to what is happening there. Media does not talk what's happening about there, and they do talk about only about scandals when there's certain suicides or like or some kind of attack or anything like that. But the 99% of time, this institution is left unobserved. Secondly, we say that they are hierarchically both formally and socially. Formally, that is to say, if you are lieutenant or a sergeant, you do have a complete authority over the other soldiers, and if they disobey, there will be consequences. And you do have actually formal authority to implement this, enforce those consequences. And socially, they are hugely social, and the way people interact is in that institutions, in barracks, is that there is a lot of traditional authority there, because like people who went to army when they're young rose through the ranks, and now a sergeant also do like the system because they went through that system, and they do think that this is beneficial. And that means all of that nature is actually all nature of that relationship is structured about social hierarchy, where the soldiers that are actually the most unworthy asset. Why? Because they do not have authority, no formal, no social here. And secondly, they are easily replaceable, because you can always get another people from the draft, expel person from the draft, and you do not see the value of individual soldiers in the extent that you could have actually see on the alternative.
Clarification.
Yeah, sure.
Could you please provide us some examples of the negligence that will be sued in the courts?
Okay, I'm about to do that. So also the soldiers are inexperienced, and so they do not cannot appeal to any traditional authority as well. All of that means in the status quo, these people are most vulnerable in the system. What are the consequences of that? Firstly, we believe they are abused in the status quo, individual soldiers. For example, that's at the point they're beaten by their peers or their high-ranking officials to teach them, which are actually the result of the toxic masculinity, and this is the way people assert their authority by actually harming the other individuals in that institutions. And this is the negligent on the behalf of high-ranking officials, because they do allow this kind of things to happen. And we believe this is the instance, I guess, that you asked in your POI. So that means these people suffer, and they do also not only physically but also this immense psychological pressure, because they are literally bullied by their peers or by the high-ranking commanding officials, and that they do not fit into, and they do actually are bullied for no rational reasons. They simply just because they do not fit in the larger group, because they kind of weird. For any other irrational reasoning that bullying happens, this is similarly it happens in the army as well. So soldiers, like the 95% of the army, is actually suffering in the status quo, and that they are vulnerable to the power abuse from the above. So this is the impact number one. So how does it affect other individuals? We believe other individuals are also, the particular soldiers are committed to commit certain crimes on the behalf, either as a result of peer pressure, or because they are threatened to, by being sent away to the military tribunal for disobedience. That means in the status quo, the things like war crimes are more likely to happen, because if you do not rape, you would be actually perceived as I don't know the word, but actually you do have to rape in order to fit into the larger context. You do also have to kill civilians if you get that order, and you also do have to cover up certain mistakes of your peers if they are committing something. If someone is looting, you do not talk about this, because due to the social immense pressure, and because you know that it is futile action to actually complain to the higher ranking officials, and it is actually also something that is negligent, and because it's neglect of the laws of the just war, and this is something that should not be complained, and it is also would be grounds to appeal to the civilian court on our side of the house. But before I move on, I would like to take a POI from closing, if there is any. Okay, so what happens on alternatives and how do we solve that problems? Firstly, we believe we do get a lot of transparency on our side of the house, because soldiers are now feel more protected and more empowered. Why? Because they can complain, and they know that the civilian court can be objective to the extent that is possible in the individual countries. So if soldiers are bullied, they can actually report that and they get compensation for that. So we don't think this is a problem, would be a problem on the alternative. And secondly, they can report the other misbehavior of the other of their peers, for example, and that would institute a higher system of actually overseeing each other and the control. That means the likelihood of happening war crimes is far less on their side of the house, or on our side of the house. So opposition may probably talk about that it would hinder the efficiency of certain orders, and there are some orders that have to be implemented instantly. We say this won't be a problem because most of the appealing to the court probably would happen post factum. That's to say, you already implemented the order, but you go to the court and say that the order was actually unlawful. We believe at this point efficiency is not harmed, but what you do get on our side of the house is post factum justice, which is also important both for the victims and also in order to punish the perpetrators and the deterrence effect that follows from that. For all of that reason, so proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for this very fine speech, and I would like to give the floor to the Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Okay. We believe that open gov is completely forgetting that we actually allow to sue governments, not the generals or not the high authorities within the army who pursued with the bullying or pursued with the mistake itself, meaning that the bullying won't disappear because those authorities still are uncharged on the side of the government. What is more, opening gov does not explain why government is actually responsible for all the actions that are taking place in the army and how it is ever going to be effective in prevention of all of those crimes that is described by the opening government. We will show you why involving civilian courts and civilian actors into this process would harm the efficiency of the army itself, and why it doesn't contribute to any efficacy on their side of the house. They tell us about soldiers who cannot appeal to tribunal, who now are insecure. We believe that the legitimate option here is to allow them access to the tribunal itself, where they will be able to sue the generals or sue the army authorities who committed some crimes against them, meaning that the efficacy and the all kind of benefit that OG is talking about is achievable with this method. What we see problematic with the government suing, especially in a civilian courts, this will also engage with impact of the opening government about more bigger prevention of war crimes. Will tell you why this won't happen at all. So first of all, we believe that generals and army authorities have an incentive to be efficient now without involvement of any government authorities. Why? Because the stake of theirs is now their career and reputation. If they make a mistake or if they are negligent, this means that they would lose their career, they would lose the opportunity to lead the army further. We also believe that negligence can include the instances of inefficient operations, for example, because the generals didn't investigate the case on a proper level. Second reason why generals are actually motivated to be efficient is because military tribunal is still in place. In case they make a mistake and government decided they made a mistake, or society sees that there is a mistake, army authorities will be forced to prosecute this general for him to lose the career and to understand his mistake. Also, we believe that these are the people who chose the career to be generals and to serve in the army. Therefore, they have incentive to care about soldiers, to care about civilians they protect, and to make the operation as efficient as it is possible. And opening gov only presumes that these people are complete criminals who do not care about all the impacts of their actions. And fourth reason is that social pressure still exists on this because the army is not unwatched as opening government is talking about this. We get reports, we see the reports on media, we see the official reports from ministries of internal affairs. Therefore, we can watch what these people do and can press on them in case they make mistake. But we believe that involving civilian authorities like government will actually make the efficacy of it worse. Why? Because this will now incentivize government authorities to invade into the flow of how army make the decision. Why? Because if on our side of the house, only generals are responsible for all the mistakes that take place. Now, governments with all the deputies in it will be responsible for this mistake. Therefore, they will want to deprive of the chance, to get rid of the chance to be prosecuted, meaning that they will now can use a lot of methods to invade into the process. What are the methods? This can be Security Council that will now include deputies. This can also be a new flow where any decision should be approved by the parliament or by any other government authority, meaning that we actually block the army from making decisions on all levels, on operational, on tactical, and on strategical ones. What are the impacts of this? First is the time loss, because now any general or any army authority will need to go to the Security Council or will need to go to Parliament to approve the decision to pursue with the operation, or to approve the decision to make some kind of concession in order to make tactic change of your army allocations. Meaning, and war and time at war is very important, because this is the process when your soldiers are being killed and when civilians you're protecting are in danger, meaning that the more time you spend, the more soldiers you lose, meaning that actually involvement of this government authority will result in more death of soldiers, and also this will result in tactical advantage of the enemy, because now they will be able to take some important positions or to reallocate their armies in order to be more advantageous on the war field, meaning that our army will not only won't be able to protect us as efficiently as it did previously, but also it will lose any chances to win in the war, and this is completely problematic. We also believe that this is efficient decisions, because the deputies or parliament members who will now be engaged into decision making have actually no expertise in the warfare, because they were elected to protect our interests in any other sphere they are experts in. However, they have no knowledge about the tactics, about the strategy, about what the concession should be. And as now they will be included into the decision-making process, the decisions itself will be less efficient, because now they will be aimed at protecting the government members rather than making the operation efficient. We also believe that the government members can have different incentives, because they are engaged in different groups, in different lobby groups, in different parties, and all these parties have different interests. Therefore, they can have different incentives within the warfare, while army has the only incentive to protect the citizens of the countries they're serving for, meaning that having the government authorities within these councils and within the decision-making process, we create the conflict of interest and create the obstacle for the decision to be efficient. And we also believe that these government authorities won't care about their career, because their career is not at warfare. Therefore, even if the mistakes still take place, the government itself is not responsible for this. It is a general who is going to lose his job, meaning that they will also won't be incentivized to make efficient decisions. This will result in more death, in less efficient operations, in worse warfare, and this is surely not an impact we would like to have. Therefore, we are proud to oppose.
I thank the leader of the opposition. I give the floor to the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
So I'll talk about three things. First, on comparison between efficiency versus avoiding negligence. Second, comparing the practical impact that would have taken place in both worlds. And thirdly, why, if like everything is not true, still our soldiers have a basic necessity to receive the justice. But before that, let's clear this debate out. So what are we talking about in the side of opening government? Let's say if yes, there are some instances like bullying, but there are also some instances like torturing innocents. Things like war crimes, when you kill innocent people, when you do operations using the methods that are unlawful. Here, opening opposition notes that in many instances it's not actual government to blame; it's actually officers and other things. We think no. In many instances where war crimes, where torturing innocent take place, there is a direct instance of government participation. Let's say Ministry of Internal Affairs have a direct knowledge of what actually happens here, because they provide all of those infrastructures. Let's say infrastructure to torture, infrastructure like drugs or gas operation, where they actually need to be provided all of those gas things that are actually unlawful to use in many instances. That's the weapons and methods need governmental approval, and in many instances governments have this participation, and we think that what we talk about in open government still works in this debate. So second thing that I want to talk about is efficiency versus negligence. Let's say opening opposition talks about all of those operations being inefficient and people dying. So there are three answers to that. First, when do we go to things that are negligent? Let's say when does government make war crimes? When does government make unlawful methods to win wars? We think those methods are done at the point in which you have no alternatives. Let's say at the point in which you have failed all those operations in the past, you have to be negligent, and you have to make war crimes. I think that all those things can be deterred if government could have been more efficient. Let's say if alternatively you made more efficient operation, you considered all of those things, there would be no necessity to be negligent. There would be no necessity to make war crimes, to kill innocent, or to torture innocent people. Let's say at the status quo, when you as government or you as commander of the army think that when all alternatives fail, you have some method to rely on. Let's say you have some unlawful method that you can use and government will approve. You are inefficient in the status quo. That's say you do not make your best because you know that if you fail, you still have other plan that is unlawful, plan that is unconstitutional. Let's say in alternative world, in our world, those governmental authorities do not keep this in mind, and we believe in our world their efficiency is maximized, and all the harms that opening opposition talks about can be deterred. But secondly, though, even if in our world, even if opening opposition is like successful to prove that there will be some deaths, that people will die, I think the comparison is whose responsibility is it? Is it responsibility of state that allowed their citizens to die, that allowed those inefficient operations, or is it responsibility of innocent people that die in war crimes? I think this is much more responsibility of the state. That's say even if you're a civilian of a state, you have voted for the state, you supported this party that is actually involved in the operation. And we believe that responsibility lies on the state, and therefore all those innocent civilians that die in war crimes should be priority. But therefore, though, we believe all the benefits that opening opposition achieve are unlawful. Why? Because all those benefits are achieved in the backs of the people who suffer, in the backs of the people that are deprived of their basic human rights. Let's say when you torture innocent people to get the information, you deprive their basic human rights, and all those benefits are illegitimate. And this is very important because this debate is about legitimacy, is about basic rights, because this is a policy motion, and we believe that in the policy motion, what is basic is to consider basic human rights. So the second thing, the third thing that I want to talk about is like comparing the practical impact. I think that yes, there are maybe some practical impact on the opening opposition, but there are also many more practical impacts on our side of the house. Let's say when you do not allow war crimes, you do not allow revenge that comes from the civilians. Let's say you do not allow ISIS to recruit many members from common people, because you do not kill common people, and therefore you do not make them give them motivation to revenge and to be recruited by ISIS, by Taliban, etc. That's say on our side of the house there is still efficiency because one, you do not deprive people from their rights, and secondly, though, your soldiers are not bullied. You have efficient soldiers that trust you, that trust that government is the authority. So the question of this debate, can we give like this right to the soldiers? And the thing that opening government perfectly addresses this question, because we already proved to you that even if all the practical impacts like are the same, that in both worlds we can deter some practical harms, or in both worlds we can achieve some benefits by employing this motion. But I think that why opening government wins, because opening government talks about principle of justice. That's say every citizen have a right to sue their government, and this is a basic human right, because we already proved to you why justice should be objective, that justice shouldn't be biased, because on the side of the opening opposition, justice is biased because of the all reasons that we gave for you. But however, on our side of the house, we have independent justice that cannot be lobbied by the parliament or any government. But beside that, all the military soldiers are citizens, are the same citizens, and we believe that this is the basic human right, and we should always be allowed to sue the government, even if there are like some externalities.
Kindly, Deputy Prime Minister, give the floor to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Yes, thank you. 1 second. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, what we say to you today is there is no changes at all about the war crimes or the negligence that happens inside the military units that the OG describes, but there are huge changes in matter of operations, in how the war is getting actually done, and what happens on the war. So some more rebuttal to the OG. We on the thing that they say about the military units and war crimes, our answer is that the tribunals that exist right now are really efficient and really enough to actually do all those stuff that they're explaining. And even though they gave some analysis why soldiers or surgeons don't actually have some kind of incentives to make this effective, what we say to you is that firstly, those the guys that right now are in the tribunals are not the usual soldiers. They are not engaged in that all of the kind of soldiers things and hierarchy, because there are usually the jurists that were gone to the tribunals because they have some specific knowledge. So that means they don't have that incentives, those incentives that the OG describes, because they was educated with specific aim to actually pursue, and this is to make justice and to make justice okay. But secondly is this because their incentives is actually to make justice good and to actually decide whether it was negligence on whether the harm was done to the soldier or no, because this is what their career is based on. It is not that based on the soldier's hierarchy, because they're the jurists. Therefore, if they will not take the right decision and will make some biases towards the soldiers, they will be firstly not get their career ahead again, because the people will see that they're taking not the right decisions. But secondly is because they will be sued as well, because if the judge takes the wrong decision, that we have some ways to actually also impact him and influence him, because society still watches towards him and watches towards his decisions where they were justice enough or not. So that means the tribunals are still enough to actually do everything that OG explains, and there is no changes in this case because they're basically changing the one court for another. That means that if their logic, even if right, that means that court will be ineffective as well for the same reasons that they're explaining, because there also might be the lobbyism coming from politicians or coming from the generals or from other political groups that don't want this person to get sued. Therefore, there is no changes in that case. But also what my teammate explains to you is that the generals have the incentives already to do some good stuff, firstly towards the soldiers, because what I'm adding here is because it's simply ineffective. If you have some people kicking others in your military unit, that means that your military unit is not effective, and therefore those generals have the incentives to stop and prevent those things, to actually sue people and to make those military courts be effective. And this also applies to the cases of war crimes. Generals don't really want doing that because they understand, for all the reasons that you explained, that people will go to the ISIS because for that. That means the generals don't want actually their soldiers in doing that. But what that means is that the government doesn't explain how this impacts the soldiers. They explain how this impacts the generals. But if we say to you that nothing changes here, then it doesn't matter. But in the case of soldiers, that because of nothing impacts them, that means that they continue making those crimes. And mostly, probably, they will create those crimes even more, because they understand that the responsibility is not for them for committing those crimes, but probably on the government that will be sued. And the society will say that the government is bad, or probably the generals. And as we understand, the most of the war crimes are getting actually done by the soldiers and not the generals, because generals don't want them to do that. Because soldiers cannot control every time their emotions and what they do. Therefore, soldiers continue creating those crimes even if they were created. Yes, but what
Question.
we say to you is that we lose a lot in the efficiency of the operations for the reasons that my teammate explains to you. Because and why it is important also in the comparative to the OG. Because firstly, if the war is more inefficient, or the operations will be inefficient, that means that a lot of more soldiers will die because of those useless and not effective decisions. Therefore, soldiers, by their criteria, are not getting protected. But secondly, if the decisions are not effective, that means it will take a much longer time for the war to actually end, or the operation to end. And therefore, again, the more soldiers dying because the war continues to exist, but also those kind of people, the usual people who are not responsible, who actually, the usual civilians, they also continue to suffer because of the longer war happening. That means that a lot more war crimes will be happening because we don't change the incentives of soldiers in doing them. But secondly, they will suffer usual things coming from war, not only from the war crimes, but the usual kind of war things like getting destroyed their buildings, or then not possible to actually go to work to get their money, and therefore they're starving, and so on and so on. Therefore, it is crucially important in this debate to actually explain why those operations will be effective. And my teammate tells you that because government right now is not that actually engaged in taking those kind of decisions, because right now they most of the decisions on the operative and tactical level are given to those councils that take the decisions, security councils, or the military units itself. In the status future, those incentives will be changed, because government right now have the incentives to actually not get sued, because there are probably a lot of the soldiers will sue, and because a lot of the soldiers involved at war, and therefore the government will lose a lot of money, and therefore they will create they will put their people inside those councils, and therefore make them ineffective. And that's what we want to tell you in that case, that because it will be a lot more ineffective in all the reasons, and it is comparatively worse, please oppose.
Okay, I thank the deputy leader of the opposition, and I invite the member of the government to continue this debate. Here.
Like, first of all, can you hear me? Is it good? Is I'm audible?
Yes, you're audible. Yes.
Okay, everything. So give me some time. I order my papers and I will start. So I'm ready. I hope everything is good. 3, 2, 1. I'll talk about two things. Firstly, I will explain why this is the principal debate and why effectiveness is less important than principle, and how we win, significantly extending in that clash opening government. Secondly, I talk about effectiveness, even if you don't buy principle. But before, two clarifications. Firstly, what is negligence? Negligence is not just bullying. Negligence is twofold on our side. First is ineffective decisions that leads to significant injury or death of soldiers. For example, if you order an operation that doesn't make sense, or means that the number of soldiers certainly will die, and it is unworthy sacrifice because you certainly don't get it. But secondly, it is the negligence is that you order or you close, like you cover up the war crimes and does not expose the war crimes that happened because someone didn't follow orders properly, or because someone was forced to torture because you thought that this person must be tortured because you can get information. Those things are negligence that leads to unnecessary injuries of civilians or soldiers. Second model, we think that in terms of a model, we sue the government, and I will explain why government is responsible. And after you sue the government leads like open, thorough investigation. I explain how it changed, why it is not the why it is the comparative, and what happens on the side opposition. So two things. Firstly, principle. In terms of the principle, we believe two notes here are important. The first note here is the responsibility of government. We think that government is responsible for military operations for two reasons. Firstly, note that government is the institution that appoints generals, that sets the military policy, and that decides what operation will happen. It also controls the whole system from inside. And look at this, the unique actor, because given that the army is closed, the government is the only instance that actually can interfere and can control. Therefore, it is unique. But secondly, more importantly, in terms of the principle, we say that government owns a soldier responsibility. Note that the subscription, the instance when you go to army, means you like entirely surrender your autonomy to the government and to the officials. That means that you have no capacity to influence your life. You have no ability to make decisions. That means that government that took that autonomy owns you a responsibility, like owns you an obligation to ensure that everything happens in the best way. So it uses you as a soldier in the best way, in the most efficient way possible. It never sacrifices you purposelessly. The analogy is this: as a citizen of any country, you have surrendered your autonomy to the government, but you also know that government owns your responsibility. The case in army is the same, but the scale is exaggerated much more. You just have less autonomy and the government has more responsibility. Negligence means misuse of troops and misuse of you as a soldier. So it means that the government did not fulfill the obligation to care about you in the first place, and you owe the principal obligation, and you have the principal right to restore them. But secondly, note that in the vast majority of cases, what we are talking about is like war crimes. Why are they connected? In the vast majority of cases, the people who undergo war crimes have a significant moral injury. Why it is important? Because war crime is something that inherent to the army, and you're forced in the vast majority of cases. You're simply ordered, and you cannot disobey. You're ordered to torture the people or order to kill the civilians. The reason for that, it is because your generals believe that like these civilians may be the danger, or they cannot count, they do not want to risk, they just want to kill them and classify the information. This is the problematic because currently you have no capacity to rectify that. And the moral injury, the fact that you have to kill, for example, innocent boys, girls, and women, it is like the trauma for the rest of your life. It's truly the limitation of autonomy. Note this significant harm. Why it is never addressed on our side opposition. They talk that currently tribunals are efficient. Three notes on that. Like the first of all, look, even if tribunals exist, two problems occur. Firstly, the army is classified institutions. That means there are a number of classified information to which tribunal have no access. That means they have limited power. But secondly, even if like reports exist and even if tribunal investigates something, several problems. First of all, soldiers in the vast majority of cases threatened by their commanders or by other people and forced not to reveal this information. The reason why it happens, it is because they know. And the reason why they cannot overwhelm that fear is that they know that information will remain in army and never will be revealed to public. That means that even if they, for example, reveal something, they have no capacity, they have no protection from outside. Secondly, the cover-up exists. Given that army investigates the army, and army has an incentive to cover up all war crimes because of war crimes or like negligent misuse of troops, because it doesn't want to undermine its authority and its trustworthiness. Those tribunals are not efficient because they kind of investigate this themselves. Given that they have support each other, they never help. They never thoroughly investigate. The point that means that tribunals are highly inefficient as comparative to open courts that is the truly outer body and investigates everything outside. Thirdly, then brief note about efficiency. Why on our side the investigation is more efficient and we prevent war crimes and misuse? Two things to note here. First of all, recognize that right to sue on our side overwhelms the injustice, like the instance of classified information. And given that you have currently the public on your side, you can expose everything. And it means you expose the all lies of government and all things that government did. But secondly, the government is incentivized to prevent misuse in the first place, because the exposure means you will have pressure, public pressure. That means that you're much more likely not to get proper funding for your army. You're more likely to get pressure from different institutions investigating you and interfering, which army doesn't want. The twofold impact from that. First of all, note that they significantly improve the quality of operation. Opening government said, opening opposition says, oh, maybe it is too long and we not like do proper order and operation is harmed. On our side, people will think twice whether the operation is worth it in and of itself. So in advance, we sacrifice lives and we save lives and prevent inefficient misuse. That significantly improves, increases the number of lives that are going to be saved. For all those reasons, propose.
Thank the member of the government, and I give the floor to the member of the opposition. Here, here.
Mic check. Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, Mr. Chair, the soldiers all around the world, and no matter what country they serve in, they serve to fulfill a fundamental purpose to the society. That is to prevent the society from any harm that can occur from the other states. Firstly, I would like to introduce you what is the role of the army and what is the responsibility of the government in this debate. Secondly, I want to clarify what means negligence. Thirdly, I will present you the argument why the case that CG has just run is not applicable to this case. Fourthly, I will provide you arguments that I will structure later. But to start, first thing, the role of the army, that is to firstly protect the government and protect the society from any harms that could affect from the other states. Secondly, that is to help the society in the case of needs, if any dramatic, unforeseen, this major situation occurs, to help the citizens, to help to provide infrastructure. Thirdly, in case if it's needed, to fight abroad for usually the freedom of your citizens or for the purposes of the greater good. That is to say, in this debate, we are clearly speaking about the countries that if they will ever appear to be in a state of war, 95% of the times, it will be the defensive war, not the offensive war, during which most likely there will be no war crimes. Secondly, what is the responsibility of the government in this debate? First of all, we have to clarify that the government is not responsible for the actions of the single unit. We have to remember that whatever the individual does, the government has no way to control and to remove any actions of that individual. That is to say, the whole cases that the government side is running is not applicable to this case, just because the fact that the government may be sued and may be forced to pay to the soldier or to anyone else for the damages that their soldiers have caused will not change anything in the world, because there is no way that the government will be able to prevent those things from happening. Okay. Why it is important to note that the soldiers in this motion will be only applicable to the citizens of your own country, because if we talk about the soldiers of the other country that have been suffering from the war crimes, then they will be not your soldiers and they cannot sue their government for this, but they will be citizens who sue your government. Okay, why the things that CG are saying right now is not true? First of all, we have to apply the Radbruch formula that was formed after the World War II. That is to say that in case of any war crimes or any inhuman acts, inhuman orders, the order does not bind on you as on a soldier. That was repeated as well during the home war in the Yugoslavia in the end of the 20th century. And that is to say, if you have been ordered to commit an unhuman crime, you are not obliged to do that, and you will be not bearing any responsibility, neither civil or soldier responsibility. Therefore, the people who commit those crimes have no incentive and have no right to sue the government for any moral suffering that they claim they have suffered, because they are willing to commit those crimes, and therefore they should be responsible for their own actions. What we want to propose on the closing opposition as the arguments why the government shall not be sued for the soldiers, why soldiers cannot sue government for negligence. First of all, that is to say that we clearly support the responsibility of the individual. That is to say, as we stated before, government have no incentive whatsoever of bearing responsibility, financial responsibility towards a soldier that commit the unhuman acts on their own. And we have to remember that the soldiers, that the soldiers that will be taking part during the war, let's say that's the best case scenario for the government. If the government deliberately will attack the dignity and the life of the soldiers, we have to remember that they have to sacrifice the individual for the entire community, for the entire society. Why we think that society is more important in this case when the soldier is there to protect the society? First of all, soldier has to react to the actions that are occurring on war, and the civilians can't. Therefore, it's very hard to judge what is human action and what is not human action on the war as well, unless you have clearly stated unhuman acts that you know that are principally and morally wrong. That is to say, when individual has to bear responsibility, that also will show the justice to the soldier that have suffered from the negligence, because he will see that the soldier that is higher in the rank, or any official from the state that is responsible to provide the products to the army, or anything else that could be counted as negligence from the government, shall not be responsible, the government as the whole, but shall be responsible that only individual, because it's his fault that he didn't provide those things. If the government would be responsible and government would have lost, that individual, that soldiers that would sue the government would only feel, okay, I won, but the people responsible for that have not suffered whatsoever. If he sues the individual and the individual loses, he will be punished, and therefore justice will be served. Why the state cannot be responsible? First of all, if there is a war, that means there is a crisis situation. The government is spending a lot of money for the war, and the state is very, very in a very difficult financial position. Therefore, every soldier pretty much could find some negligence from the state of government, and everyone could sue the government. Therefore, they couldn't really fulfill the defensive obligation towards the society, and therefore they cannot really protect the state, which has some obligations towards them, but therefore will fall during that war. But even if there is no war, we still have to say that the person, the individual responsible is shall be sued, because if the government doesn't have the money to provide the items that or anything else that the soldiers should have known, then we cannot really talk about the negligence. But if we have money and the soldier and the individual didn't do that, then he is responsible personally, and that is for the purposes that I have provided before. Thirdly, army and why defense is much more important than the soldiers. Antoni will provide a little bit more on that. Thank you.
I thank the member of the opposition, and I give the floor to the government whip. Here.
Everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Upon entering the army, soldiers do give up a huge part of their autonomy, something that makes them human and something that therefore warrants justified use by the government to which they do secede that autonomy. We think that allowing soldiers to sue the government in cases of negligence is actually giving those soldiers justice and therefore enforcing their autonomy in the best case possible. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. First of all, do soldiers have a principal right to sue the government? And secondly, is the army going to be more efficient? But first of all, a couple of clarifications. So first of all, what is negligence? We think that negligence is much larger than what OG tells you. We think that negligence is basically causing any unnecessary suffering to civilians or soldiers. We think some examples of this that would crystallize this debate even more are, for example, the operation of the European Union in Somalia, where they tried to, bomb, to commit airstrikes against the pirates, but ended up striking against civilians because they didn't, take enough time to analyze whether the people who they're targeting are actually criminals or not. Or, for example, the bombings of Belgrade that also caused unnecessary harms to the civilians, and we think that could be prevented. We think that, therefore, the main criterion for negligence is causing harms to both civilians and soldiers when that harm could be avoided. Secondly, who do we sue in this debate? We tell you that we probably sue the Department or Ministry of Defense as a government body that is responsible for any military operations. Thirdly, what governments have to prove in courts? We think that on our side of the house, they have to show that they exerted their best effort to prevent any unnecessary deaths. That is to say that they don't have to, say that they did 100% of what they could, but we think that they need to show that they exerted the best effort that they could in the conditions given. Fourthly, we think that also there is a difference between war crimes and negligence, right? Because war crimes are already, suable in the status quo. We think that negligence or causing unnecessary harms are the things that are not sued and should be able to be sued for on our side. Fifthly, we think that also this is not only about the debate, not only about wars, but also about military operations, which is going to be useful later on. And sixthly, I think that the addition of CG, which is like, in case you were attacked, you can protect yourself. We think that that is out because self-defense doesn't require you to cause any unnecessary suffering to any individual. It's literally just self-protection. We think that if you engage in self-protection with the aim to minimize the losses that you have, which is always the aim of self-defense, it is unlikely that that is going to cause unnecessary suffering at all. Right? So first question, do soldiers have a principal right to sue their government? I think OG gives you a consequentialist claim, which is soldiers are most vulnerable in the hierarchy of army and they experience the power abuse by the higher ranked. I think first of all, that is a fine principle, but it probably applies to a small number of cases because already there are institutional checks in armies because branding and the way army is perceived in society is important for recruiting. So it is, if it is perceived as, impeding on the power dynamic within that fewer people are incentivized to go to the army, which is important to the state. But secondly, as OO rightfully points out, we think that they do miss the link between why governments are directly responsible for bullying. Notice that the principle of my partner doesn't rely on bullying or any consequentialist harms. In fact, he tells you that currently in army, so when soldiers go to the army, either under mandatory conscription or voluntarily conscriptions, they do inevitably sacrifice part of their autonomy, which is they do sacrifice part of their ability to make free choices. We think that autonomy is essentially our basic right. It is our basic freedom, something that makes us human. We think that governments writ large are created to protect the autonomy of everyone or to minimize harm to that autonomy, because that's literally the purpose of the state, to create collective protections. We think that when government causes unnecessary harms, it actually forfeits obligation to people, because the reason why people give up their parts of their autonomy, parts of their free will to the government, so that the government can protect them better. We think that when government exposes soldiers to inflicting unnecessary harms on civilians, it's actually forfeiting its duty. What is the mechanism? When you kill someone, and when you know that that harm could have been avoided, that causes you immense PTSD or moral injuries, because you know that you've taken lives from children, from women who could have lived otherwise if your government acted more responsibly. We think that that is immense harm to an individual that can be and should be protected. We think suing, therefore, is justified. What are the responses of CG? First of all, they tell you that governments can prevent negligence. We say they can because they have intel, and also they can use statistics and projections in order to predict the possible harms. Sure, it's going to take more time. We're willing to buy that. Secondly, they tell you that soldiers can opt out of operations. We tell you that that's not the case because they're going to go to the tribunal, and also social norms prevent them from doing that. Therefore, our principle is true and stands in this debate. Why is this most important part in the debate? We think that because regardless of the efficiency, sacrificing or using an individual as a means to end and inflicting unnecessary harm, then when that harm can be avoided, is always an evil. Secondly, about the efficacy of the army, and refuting mostly to the case of OO, they tell you that generals in the status quo are motivated to prevent negligence, we tell you that even if that you totally buy their argument, when one instance of negligence occurs, it is going to go undetected and unjustified, unjustly punished on opposition side, because you have no right as a soldier to, get retribution. Therefore, the moral harm is always going to happen on their side of the house, and they have no means of preventing that. But let's talk about their reasoning. They tell you, first of all, generals have an incentive to care about their soldiers because it's personal choice. We tell you that in the status quo, negligence occurs all the time because in army, time is valued upon the precision of the decisions. For example, when the bombing of Belgrade was committed, or the EU naval operations against the civilians of Somalia, those operations were largely attributed as successful because they achieved their aim, regardless of the fact that they caused unnecessary harm. So therefore, the norm in the army already is that even if, you cause some unnecessary harm, the fact that you act timely and fast is actually better, because that, for some reason, is considered more important. So therefore, we think that in the status quo, generals are already desensitized to soldiers' feelings, and therefore don't have an incentive to protect them as much as they could. Secondly, we think that in terms of social pressure, there are many operations that are secretive, and the army is the only channel that has the ability to supply that information to the public. Therefore, the public, in many instances, does not know about those unnecessary harms until the very late, and therefore doesn't check against that, right? But in terms of change, right, because OO tells you that decisions are going to be made slower, we think that we're willing to buy that harm. Why? We actually think that more time doesn't mean to more losses of soldier deaths. Why? Because when you are in a military operation, not making an active decision means that you're probably going to be on the guard, meaning that you will still be able to engage in self-defense and protect your soldiers in case you're attacked. What it actually means is that you will not be able, on our side of the house, to make any offensive decisions that fast. We think that that is actually good, because you're taking more time to make better decisions, because in case you make bad decisions on their side of the house, which is more likely, you give more incentives to the other side to backlash against you, because they kill their civilians, and therefore you cause more threats to your own soldiers. But secondly, you probably end up killing more civilians, even that civilians don't as soldiers, consent to being harmed, because they can't prevent that. We think that even if you kill, more soldiers are killed on our side of the house, that is justified at the expense of saving more civilians on our side. Thank you.
I thank the government whip, and I give the floor to the opposition whip to close this debate. Here.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay. So as my partner already stated, the prime role of the army is to protect the society, protect the government itself, protect the entire country. And even if the army in certain instances is toxic, is shitty for the soldier, there are some negligence happening in there. It's mostly because in order to fulfill their role in the best possible guys, often the priorities are taken to the other places, and all the harm to the soldiers, like bullying, that especially opening government is talking about, is just a byproduct of the necessary drill, of the discipline and things like that are necessary to keep the soldiers in life, to make sure that they are actually doing the orders when they are set to do so, where their morale is high enough that they are still ready to fight for their country, etc. And we believe that in the situation where they are much more focused on questioning the actions of their own country instead of focusing on their responsibility, their efficiency is going much lower. And here we come again to the point that that in this debate, the responsibility of army to protecting the country is more important than the rights of certain individuals. Closing government comes here and tells you that no, it's not necessarily the case, because soldiers given up some autonomy. Yes, but the full picture is a little bit bigger than that. Because in the same way that we gave up, the government had legitimacy to limit our rights because we agreed to do so, we also agreed to have an army, we also agreed to diminish some rules when it comes to the army, because we see how important it is in order to keeping us safe, regardless if being a soldier is voluntary or not. In the certain country, the soldiers, when they go there, they are they know that their rights are to some extent diminished when they are in the army. And if they're in the situation, and if we show that actually allowing them to take those to sue the government in those situations will negatively impact their ability to fulfill their role as protectors of the country, we win this debate, and we show it to you by showing to you that how important is their morale, how important is that they actually focus on winning this war. But even if government side would prove to you that that this is not the case, and somebody should take the responsibility for the negative actions which are taken to the which are being done to the soldiers, the harm coming from negligence, we still believe that this is still the responsibility of certain individuals and not necessarily of the government itself. Especially because of the reasons that my partner gave you, that first of all, the government is not really able to control every single situation that is happening, right? It's perfectly fine to punish the individuals who did it, to help government if government actually does it. But if the necessary steps which government had to take in order to prevent this would probably lead to some extent to lowering the discipline, to diminishing authority of the soldier who is above you in the ranks, and negatively impacting the structural integrity of the rank. We believe that this is the reason why it should not happen. And also because, as my partner told you, yeah, sure.
Proving that government is not responsible is not enough to claim that we should not allow soldiers to have their basic rights. We still have investigations. If they are not responsible, this would be determined.
Sure. I mean, if you believe that civil courts are better suited than the army tribunals to deal with this issue, sure, allow civil courts to do it. But the protest should be against the individual who is responsible to committing the crime of harm towards the soldier, whether it's like the sergeant in the army or some certain individual private person who has some function in the government or is a general or something like this, not the country itself, who never was able to actually do it. But even if you believe that civil court would be better suited to do it, we still believe that the government should not be the side who is suited, especially because the war itself is a very critical situation where there are many hard decisions which had to be taken, and often the generals or the other people in hierarchy to some extent are negligible towards the soldier, but only because they are focusing on the more important goals in this situation. And we believe that allowing soldiers to actually question the actions of, or especially the actions of the country, which is the very thing that they are there to protect, will only negatively impact the integrity of the army, their morale to fight, their morale to actually fulfill their role in the future. And finally, taking a few moments also to talk about war crimes. We believe that because you were never forced to actually do it from the law of your country to commit those crimes, we don't believe that you should that you should have the right to actually get something get some that you should have the right to sue the country because of this. Firstly, because the victims of this are actually not the soldiers themselves. We believe that even if you were forced to not be participant, even if this happened, if you were forced to participate in this, we still believe that this is not a negligence in this form, as we are talking about in this debate. And also because you had moral right to choose not to follow this order without any responsibility. In this situation, you should not be able to take this action. So because we show you why the private individuals are the ones who should take responsibility if assuming the government proves that someone should, and also because you show you that why army's role as protection of the country is more important than the well-being of individual soldiers, we win this debate. Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you everyone for the debate. I'll take around 10 minutes to get to a decision and I'll come back with feedback. It was very enjoyable for me to judge. So my feedback's gonna go as follows. I'm gonna give you 3 main pieces of general feedback in terms of how the debate went and how I think this debate could have gone better. Then I'm obviously going to give you the call and the justification for the call. If you have any other questions, you can obviously find me and text me for personal feedback. 3 pieces of general feedback. 1, I think most of the teams in this debate essentially struggle to create a necessary causal link in order to prove to what extent does a specific actor in this debate have a responsibility for what is happening to those soldiers. What I mean is when different teams are trying to prove an alternative, therefore trying to say that other people, such as to say the soldiers themselves or generals or other third individuals are responsible to the negligence that has been caused. I'm not sure to what extent we can hold these individuals accountable, to what extent those individuals have caused this negligence, and how does the government fit into the whole picture. Therefore, I think as many people and many teams have tried to essentially defend different actors and their responsibility in this debate without actually proving why I should definitely care about one actor over another actor, I think that this made a pretty messy debate at the end. Secondly, I think there's a lack of mechanistical analysis in terms of how and why are different actors going to react in the way teams want them to react. Therefore, I am not sure to what extent when we are passing this policy, those soldiers are going to have an incentive to do this, to what extent the government will now have an incentive to impose different councils and have decisions to pass through a more complicated or a more complex discussion before them being implemented into the battlefield, or what are different actors going to do? Because I think this debate lacks to a large extent probability in terms of why are different things going to happen and what is the probability of those reactions taking place. And lastly, I think there has been essentially many different cases in which teams have based their cases upon. What I mean by that is I am not sure when are we keeping the government responsible? What are the main cases we're going to be talking about here? Because I think many different teams have tried to say that we're just talking about the general problems that the government is causing, such as trauma or stress to most of those individuals in the army. Are we talking about state of emergencies and different crises where the government should react and the government is not responsible at all for those situations? Are we talking about a genuine attack about essentially conserving some kind of an idea with European Union attack or whatever? Or are we talking about creating different war crimes within different states and essentially by that holding the state accountable? And I think in many different cases, there has been a lack of comparison between those cases in terms of which cases are the most important and are we actually talking about all of them? Having said this, the call goes as follows. I give the first to the closing government. I give the second to the opening opposition. I give the third to the opening government. And I give fourth, unfortunately, to the closing opposition. I'm going to go chronologically throughout the debate and do every single comparison. Okay, starting with opening government. Opening government brings us 2 main things in this debate. One, they try and explain that they should be a mechanism through which the soldiers should be able to sue the government and should be able to hold some people reliable to what is happening on the battlefield. Second, they try to prove that having this ability to essentially sue the government, even if it doesn't essentially lead to many different consequentialist arguments or consequentialist results, they should still have this right, because this is something that they are onto, basically because they're in the army, and they should have the ability to have some kind of a transparency and should have some kind of an ability to hold the person giving them orders accountable for what they're doing. What we're getting as a responses on those arguments from opening opposition is, one, they say this is going to be very problematic. Hence, when we're suing the government in many of those situations, then there will be a very big problem in efficiency. Therefore, this will create an even bigger problem with negligence, because once we have an inefficient system in getting to some decisions, then we're going to be much more likely to lose soldiers in the battlefield. Then we're going to be much more likely to allow the enemy to create a better flank for attacking. Then we're much more likely to not be able to react quickly enough to different responses to what is happening. Therefore, I'm unsure for us to how opening government is able to tackle this, because at the end of the day, opening government says that sometimes we should essentially take this situation and allow for different decisions to be taken quickly. But I'm unsure for us to I'm unsure how to weigh this, because at the end of the day, opening government explains to me that sometimes the state is forced to make certain decisions, and at the end of the day, they may even resort to some unlawful stuff. And therefore, I'm unsure what is the more beneficial scenario for the state to do, and essentially how to weigh this clash. At the end of the day, I decided to give it to the opening opposition, because the opening opposition is able to explain to me the big problem with essentially allowing for many individuals to sue the government, because it allows for the inefficiency. Therefore, I'm unsure for us to how opening government is able to explain to me why this lack of taking and making those quick decisions going to be something to a large extent beneficial, which is something which later in the debate, closing government is essentially able to provide as a refutation. The second clash that happens in the opening half of this debate is essentially who is responsible for creating many of this negligence. Opening government tries to prove to us that this is the government to a large extent. But the big problem with the case of opening government, in terms of how does it weigh with the claim from opening opposition, that individuals are actually responsible. I think opening government puts way too much burdens on themselves. One, they try and explain to us why, at the end of the day, the state is responsible because the state is making all the decisions and the state is able to have access to all the information. But then they say there are many other factors, such as outside pressure or pressure from your superiors to make different decisions. Therefore, I'm not definitely sure for how the causal link of opening government works. Therefore, I'm not sure for us to why the government itself has the basic responsibility for this negligence. As we're having different factors for us to why many of these soldiers are taking other decisions, such as superior commands or whatever, I'm unsure for us to why the government should be the essential actor that should be sued. Therefore, I think opening opposition engages correctly on this issue by explaining it is not the problem of the generals, it is not the problem of the government, but it is the problem of the individuals, because they're at the end of the day the ones who are essentially taking those decisions, and essentially they're the ones who are making the crimes, if any. And therefore, due to the lack of the comparison with the status quo coming from opening government, I'm unsure for us to how this causal link works and why the opening opposition claims for us to why individuals are responsible for these crimes and for this negligence. I'm unsure for us to why opening opposition's causal link doesn't work as a refutation for opening government. And very narrowly, I think, based on this clash, I think opening opposition takes it over opening government. Taking closing government into the debate. I think closing government brings us a few things. One, they're, I think, the first team in this debate who actually managed to engage within the principal argument for us to why it is only the responsible of the government to take care of the soldiers. They do this in a few ways. One, they explain once you're being able to join the army, you're essentially giving away your whole freedom and your whole desires to the government in order to protect different soldiers. Therefore, you're trusting the government that the government is going to make the best decisions for you. If the government is not able to make the best decisions and is therefore allowing for you to kill different individuals because they're like, the government hasn't researched all the options, or it is making you do something immoral without basically allowing you to have any say in it, then these soldiers definitely have the right to sue the government because the government has failed its basic mission to essentially provide those individuals with the right to be able to essentially make a legit decision on themselves, and the government has forced those soldiers and those individuals to make problematic decisions basically because of lack of research. The second thing that they essentially try to prove is that they say, we don't care if those decisions are inefficient, because at the end of the day, what we care about is once we're making offensive tactics, then we care about precision, then we care about research, and we care about not killing people and like making the best decision for those soldiers, both morally and like to the best essential impact of the state. And secondly, if there is like some kind of a defense, there is no way that essentially the state will ever have a way of like taking a lot of time to respond to this. The way they beat opening opposition is, I think, by explaining to me why at the end of the day, once those individuals are not able to make any decisions on their own because of these factors that they have already given all their thinking process to the state, they cannot be held accountable. Therefore, they bring down the second point of opening opposition by engaging on this clash. But even more importantly, I think they're able to go over opening opposition by responding to the idea that they're actually fine with taking longer to make certain decisions. And they say, we agree with the opening opposition that this is going to be certainly a problem, but this is certainly going to be something which happens, but we don't think that this is going to be a problem. Therefore, opening opposition takes the basic analysis that coming from opening opposition about what is going to happen and turns it into their advantage by essentially explaining why most of those long decisions are actually going to be beneficial for the morale of the army and for what the state is doing as a whole in terms of impact. The reason why closing government then is able to go over their opening government is, I think, they're able to fill in the gaps within the principal claim that opening government has also tried to make within this debate by essentially explaining what is the exact causal link for us to why the state is definitely responsible for all the crimes it does and definitely is responsible for all the problematic stuff many of those soldiers are experiencing on an everyday basis. Therefore, I'm now sure that the only responsible actor for the negligence is therefore going to be the government. And by having this explanation for us to why this is so, I think closing government is able to fill in the gap and therefore able to go over opening government. Lastly, including closing opposition within the debate. Closing opposition brings two main claims in this debate. One, they explain to me that the army has the only job to protect the state and to protect the citizens. But the bigger problem with this claim, and the way it weighs up, first of all, with the closing government, is I'm unsure for us to why on the ground there will not be any external factors. Therefore, I'm unsure for us to why the decisions that are made for this army to protect the citizens are solely going to be based on these individuals' free will. Because what closing opposition's claim is based on, as a premise, is the idea that individuals are definitely responsible for what they're doing, because it doesn't matter if they're receiving an order or not. If what they're doing is immoral, they always have the possibility to turn this down. But I think this remains on the basis of an assumption and I'm not sure for us to why this is the case, especially when we already have received quite a lot of framing coming from both of the governmental teams, which is to say that they already explained to me that there is a certain amount of pressure to these soldiers to follow these orders, and there's already some kind of a precedent created by these soldiers, by them considering that they're a part of the army, that they are not really capable of making all of these decisions on their own. The second claim that we're getting from closing opposition is about that basically soldiers are always supposed to put themselves above the different citizens. Therefore, the soldiers are always supposed to do whatever they are supposed to do in order to protect the citizens. Therefore, there is no right or wrong. But the problem with this claim and the way it weighs up with closing government is I'm unsure for us to why this negligence then becomes an issue. Because when closing government stand-ups and say specifically in the whip speech that many of the problems that these soldiers are creating to protect the citizens can be avoided, I'm unsure for us to why this negligence is not also the problem of the state. Because I agree with closing opposition, and I think they have a sufficient analysis to prove to me that at the end of the day, soldiers are always trying to provide the best to the citizens, but I'm not sure for us to why are there not many different ways to which the government should order the army to do this, and why many of those different ways doesn't include just doing it peacefully without negligence, which is what essentially closing government pokes as a whole within the closing opposition case, and essentially tries to mitigate it. I'm unsure for us to, in whip speech, how closing opposition deals with this. Therefore, based on this clash, I think closing government still is able to go over closing opposition. Weighing now on the long diagonal closing opposition with opening government, we have a direct engagement within the two teams where closing opposition tries to engage with opening government's ideas, which is to say that most of the cases which are going to be present in this debate are going to be on the defensive side. Therefore, the whole of the ideas and arguments based on war crimes that opening government has fall out of the debate. Again, I'm unsure for us to why this is the case, but even if this is the case, why should they only necessarily care about the cases we're talking about, which are on the defensive side, and all of the war crimes are essentially falling out of the debate? The second thing which we're getting as a response from the closing opposition on the long diagonal is that they say the government has no way of controlling the people and the people in basically the soldiers. Therefore, the government should be responsible for any of the problems that the soldiers are therefore doing. The big problem is I am unsure for us to why the government doesn't have any control over what these soldiers are doing and doesn't have any mechanism. If closing opposition proves to me that there is absolutely no mechanism through which the government can essentially tackle this, or the government in the status quo has no ability to ever, for example, hire different generals or engage on what the soldiers are doing, then I think closing opposition could definitely take it over opening government. In the debate that happened, I'm unsure for us to why the government never will have any way to control the people in the army, therefore doesn't have any responsibility whatsoever for what is happening within the army. Therefore, lastly, on the opposition bench, why is still opening opposition going over closing government, and why does closing opposition's extension not able to go over opening opposition? I think closing opposition tries to prove the same baseline as opening opposition, which is to say that individuals are the ones who are responsible for all of this, therefore they should be the ones who are held accountable for all the crimes, and they should be the one who sue each other and not them suing the government, because the government has no ability to do this. But I'm unsure for us to how are they essentially contributing enough material to essentially to be able to win this clash. Therefore, even though they're trying to prove the same baseline and bring some new reasons for us to why the government is one, not able to control its the army enough, or B, because individuals are essentially free to take enough decisions and have a moral judgment about what is right and what is wrong and avoid what is completely immoral, I'm still unsure for us to how are those contributions essentially staying and weighing up within this debate, and therefore enough to like go over opening opposition. Because at the end of both opening opposition and closing opposition, I'm still unsure for us to how this baseline of individuals are responsible is inherently proved sufficiently to the extent that closing government is not able to win in this clash. This is the justification. This is the call. If you have any other questions, you can text me. Thank you very much.